Hi, welcome back. This session, I'd like to talk about corporate life cycles in general and tech companies specifically, especially in the context of how their life cycles can be different from the life cycles of most other companies. First, let's look at what a typical life cycle looks like for a company. The company is born, of course, as an idea. The idea becomes a product. The product becomes successful, and that successful product allows the company to grow and eventually hit maturity. After a period of maturity, the company declines. Now, all of this is based on the presumption that the company does make it through what I call significant transitions, because each of these transitions you can think of as a test, which if you don't make it through, the company doesn't make it. So there's a pretty high mortality rate early in the life cycle, and that mortality rate tends to drop as the company ages. So that is the start of this discussion, is a corporate life cycle. Now, what I'd like to also talk about is what it is that determines the shape of this life cycle. In particular, why do some companies grow faster and others take longer to build up? Why do some companies' mature phases last for decades while others last only a few years? And why is decline so much more speedy in some companies than others? The general framework I would use is to think about what it is that allows companies to start up and grow, and the kinds of businesses where growth is going to be quick. So let's start at the very beginning. For companies to make it through the process, they have to be allowed to start up. So the fewer the restrictions on entry, the easier it is to enter a business, the lower the investment you need, and the greater the access to capital, the more companies are going to enter a space. Now, once you've entered the space, if you succeed, you have to scale up. And for scaling up, you need to be able to invest enough capital to scale up. In businesses where scaling up is easier, you're going to find faster growth than businesses where scaling up is slow. In addition, if you're in a business where customers are much more willing to switch away from their existing products, growth is going to be easier. You might be wondering where all of this is going, but file it away because I'm going to use this specific picture in the context of tech companies. So let's say that you've grown and you become a mature company. How long you stay a mature company will depend on how strong your competitive advantages are and how sustainable they are. For instance, we do know that consumer product companies with strong brand names have very long mature phases. Mature phases in the sense that they can live off the fat for decades. They can make extraordinary returns on investments they made early in the growth phase for 30, 40, or even 50 years. Think Coca-Cola, think McDonald's. And then the decline begins, and that decline is essentially a function of how easy it is for new companies to enter the space and how easy it is for those companies to scale up. And if you think about it, those are exactly the characteristics that allowed you to grow fast. In summary, what I'm arguing is the businesses where it's easy to enter and easy to scale up are businesses where you're going to see speedy growth and speedy declines. And the end game is the liquidation. And in some businesses, that liquidation will bring substantial proceeds. If you have physical assets you can sell off. In other businesses, there might not be much left. So let's use that context to think about technology companies versus non-technology companies. Before I embark on that, I need to step back and make a distinction. Because I think we've become very casual about the companies that we call tech companies. To think about the difference between tech and non-tech companies, let me go back to simpler times. In the 1980s, when the tech sector first started to grow, technology companies were defined mostly around whether their products and services were related to computers, either personal or business computers. So Apple and Microsoft and Atari were clearly technology companies, and the grandfathered in companies were IBM and HP and Digital Equipment were also technology companies. The rest of the market obviously was non-tech. So that was an easy distinction. Now that almost every product that we use has a computer component, whether it's an appliance or an automobile, this distinction is much more difficult to make. In fact, I think of technology more as a continuum then. On one end of that continuum are companies that are pure technology companies. I think of Google and Facebook. And on the other end of the continuum, there are some companies that are not really technology companies. There is not much technology. Applebee's is a classic example. A restaurant chain would be a classic example. But then you think about companies that fall in the middle, and you can see what I mean by a continuum. Both Ford and Tesla are automobile companies that use technology. But Tesla is obviously more tech than Ford because its automobiles depend a lot more upon technology than a typical Ford automobile does. So that's a continuum, and the reason it matters is increasingly this classification is a subjective one. And that subjective one has consequences, both in terms of the jobs that people are asked to do and how we price these companies. Let me talk about the first piece first. If you look at sell-side equity research on Wall Street, it's still broken down by sector. So you're hired as an analyst and you're given a sector to analyze. So if you're the auto analyst, you're given the auto sector. If you're the retail analyst, you're given the retail sector. Increasingly, though, there are these companies that float beneath the space where you're not sure where to put them. For the past few years, I've been keeping track of Amazon, and in about half the investment banks I look at, Amazon is classified with the retail companies. The other half, it's treated as a technology company. The same thing seems to be happening with Tesla and Netflix and the other big technology companies that are getting into spaces that used to be more conventional spaces. The reason it makes a difference is once you get put in a sector, you get tunnel vision. That's what you tend to focus on. And by taking away Amazon from the retail analyst space, I am changing his or her perspective on the pricing of companies in the space. And that brings me to my second point. How we price companies is based on who we compare those companies to. If I think of Tesla as an automobile company, it's very difficult to justify its pricing. It looks awfully overpriced. If I think of Tesla as a technology company, it's much more easy to justify its pricing. No wonder everybody wants to be a tech company. So if you accept this argument that technology is a continuum, though, here are the general propositions I have about companies that get much of their value from technology, more technology than non-tech. There are four components that characterize them. I'm not arguing that every technology company has every technology business has these characteristics, but here are the four that I see in common. The first is these are businesses where entry is easy and unchecked. They're not regulated, and scaling up is easy because you don't need much investment to grow. Second, once you grow, holding on is tough in these businesses. You don't stay as mature businesses for very long because your competitive advantages tend to be slippery. They don't last very long. Third, once decline starts, it's not only very hard to stop, it's very quick. It's very rapid. You go from a big company to a smaller company in almost no time at all. And finally, when the game is over, there's not much left to sell. Your physical assets are non-existent, and your intangible assets that your accountants might attach a number to, nobody wants anymore. If those are the defining characteristics, you can almost see what's going to happen to the life cycle for technology companies. See that life cycle to the left? That is a technology company life cycle. Your growth is quicker, your mature phase doesn't last as long, and your decline is much faster. If you're a non-tech company, it takes a lot longer for you to grow. You can stay for much longer as a mature company, and your decline tends to be much more gradual. That is, in essence, the difference between tech companies and non-tech companies. Are there consequences? Absolutely. The way you manage and invest in tech companies has to be very different from the way you manage and invest in non-tech companies. But that's for another post and another YouTube video. And this one, I want to stay focused on the life cycle. Incidentally, if you look at the evidence on this life cycle, it's still spotty. There is evidence on each proposition that tech companies grow faster than non-tech companies. That tech companies, once they mature, have a much more difficult time defending their growth. And that once they start the decline is much more precipitous at tech companies than at non-tech companies. The reason I think there is so little evidence still is this is a space where the data is just coming in. I have a feeling that by the time evidence starts to get published, that might be 10 years from now, it's going to be too late for most of us who've already lost our money because of what's happening in this space. One final point I want to make, and that is about the word disruption. Disruption was one of those words that I classified as weapons of mass distraction. Words that people use because they want to stop debate and they do not want to talk about the details. But there is a sensible way to think about disruption, especially when it comes, as it often does, from the tech space. It is when a tech company introduces a tech business model into a non-tech business, a tech life cycle into companies that are used to non-tech life cycles. And the consequences are not surprising. The companies in a non-tech life cycle, especially the mature ones, are not used to moving quickly. So when a tech company comes in, these old business companies tend to move too slowly and don't respond appropriately to the challenges that come up. And by the time they recognize as a problem, it's too late. And if you look at Uber in the car service business, you can see exactly what I'm talking about. In fact, the old players look back and look to regulators and rule makers to protect them, but that doesn't quite solve their problem. And for the tech companies in the space, a word of caution. It is true that they will be able to disrupt the old business companies fairly easily. Disruption is easy. Making money on disruption is much more difficult. So these tech companies have to face up to the fact that unless they change the nature of the business model they're bringing into the game, they too are going to be susceptible to competition just around the corner. So more on that on my next session on this topic. But that's all I wanted to say for the moment. And thank you very much for listening.